Since April of 2023, I've been playing through every mainline Zelda title in an attempt to prove to myself that I can actually finish games in the franchises that I love. The first title I completed on this journey was where this monumental series began. Zelda NES is an interesting game. I'd heard for years about how it's one of the best video games ever made and it still holds up decades on. Its gameplay is incredible, its dungeons fantastic, everything about it is just great, is the sentiment I'd seen surrounding the game from people older than me. People who grew up with the game. Seeing as how I was about -13 when Zelda NES initially released, I don't exactly fit in with the grew up with Zelda NES crowd. Video games made for the third console generation are an entirely different beast for a guy who was a kid in the early 2000s. Growing up, I couldn't even get through Winnie the Pooh's Rumbly Tumbly adventure for the GBA. Do you really think I would have been suited for 80s video game difficulty? I'd made a couple attempts in my teenage years to play through Zelda NES, but I never got very far. So what does a 24-year-old Shandy think of Zelda NES in 2023? I like it. It's a solid game. But what does a 24-year-old Shandy think of Zelda NES if he didn't have access to some sort of guide? Well, I don't love it. I didn't have access to much of Nintendo's history in my early years of gaming. My first home console from the Big N was a Wii, and aside from that, Dad had a Game Boy with classics such as Tetris, Super Mario Land, and Jack Nicklaus Golf. I had a Game Boy Advance, which admittedly did allow me some access to some NES games thanks to the multiple bootleg cartridges I owned, but why play Super Mario Bros. 3 when that same cartridge had Shrek 2 on it? It wasn't until I was maybe 11 or 12 years old that I started to actually become interested in the greater concept of video games. With some notable exceptions, I never really wanted specific games. I'd get a new video game based on a movie or TV show I liked, as was tradition for every kid growing up in the peak of licensed kids' games. I didn't really have a grasp on just how important those old games were. I'd flick through the official Nintendo magazine that Australia had and see articles about older games and think, wow, but when are we getting to Drawn to Life the next chapter? My parents were weirdly skeptical of purchasing games through digital storefronts. It took a good amount of convincing from an 11-year-old me that buying Minecraft wouldn't give their laptop a virus and I would actually get a game from it. Because of this weird hang-up, I never got to experience the Wii Shop channel. Video game history was sitting right there in front of me, but it was just out of reach. Fast forward to September of 2011 when the 3DS Ambassador Program titles released. It was there that I actually got to experience those old classics and Ice Climber. I booted up Zelda NES, got my sword, and proceeded to get my ass kicked by Octoroks and Zoras. I repeated this process for about 20 minutes and went, nope, this game sucks. I dabbled with it again here and there over the years, but it wasn't until over a decade later that I'd actually give the game another chance in earnest. Since I knew that I was going to be streaming Zelda NES, I had to put in some prep work before I went live. I thought it'd be better if the first several hours of this playthrough didn't consist of me aimlessly wandering the map with 3 hearts and a wooden sword. I went onto Zelda Dungeon and saw a section called The Gathering. It outlined a path that'd give you a couple extra hearts and some upgrades. I downloaded an image of the map and proceeded to draw lines on it so I would know exactly where I had to go. I ran through the route a couple times before I started the stream, just so I was a bit more familiar with it. I hit the Go Live button and set out on my journey. Zelda NES is an extremely impressive game given the hardware limitations and its place on the timeline of said hardware. The map is quite large and feels pretty realized, with a level of distinction between areas that's passable. A lot of it is just trees or bushes on some ground, but there's a graveyard, a mountain area, and some larger bodies of water to keep things varied. There's an on-screen map in the top corner, which I never really used. It feels like less of a map and more of a, the blinking light is you. Good luck. I'm sure it's useful to someone out there, it just wasn't for me. I didn't really fall in love with Zelda NES's Hyrule. There isn't a ton for me to latch onto. If I were to try to explain a particular screen that stuck out in my memory to someone on the street, they'd probably give me a funny look and slowly back away as I flail my arms wildly like Kermit the Frog introducing tonight's special guest. All in all, the overworld serves its purpose. It's fine. There's an impressive cast of enemies, both in terms of unique designs and recolors for added difficulty. The sprites are all really well made. I was able to tell what enemies were, such as Octoroks, Wizrobes, Keese, and so on, just by looking at them. The series has been very faithfully adapting these simple sprites for later releases. It's really cool. Some of the boss sprites look exceptionally high quality, specifically the Gleeox and Goba. It can be hard to distinguish a sense of scale in top-down games, at least for me. So to see these big chunky dragons and crabs effectively convey their ferocity through an 8-bit sprite is very impressive. While a far cry from subsequent entries, I think the dungeons are where Zelda NES really shines. While each one isn't distinctively unique, they feel different enough from each other thanks to their layouts. The puzzles within each dungeon, well, I don't love them. The typical flowchart for Zelda NES dungeons is pretty simple. You either have to kill all the enemies in the room to progress, push a block to progress, or bomb a wall to progress. You'll find keys scattered about to unlock doors, and you'll stumble upon a staircase that leads you to the dungeon item. It's nothing revolutionary nowadays, but for the time, it's quite good. Obviously, you can't get everything perfect on a first attempt, especially in an era where the games that you're making are defining genres for decades to come. While it feels bare bones to me nowadays, I know that these simple little challenges set the foundation for what are now considered Zelda staples. If playing 2D Zelda has taught me anything, it's to run into every single block from every direction on every screen, and to plop a bomb down on every single wall in the hopes that it'll reveal a hidden room. It's the sort of thing I knew going into Zelda NES, since I've grown up around the series, and it's just the done thing. Every Zelda player eventually figures out that you should try bombing walls to reveal secrets. It's a Zelda staple, if you will. The only problem is, in this entry there's absolutely no tell for some bombable walls, at least as far as I can discern. In later entries there's some sort of tiny hint for the uncracked secret walls. For example, Ocarina of Time has a different sound when you hit the wall with your sword. It's a minor gripe to be sure, but boy does it feel a bit rough sometimes. My biggest problem with the game in general is just how plain awful I am at it. As I mentioned earlier, third generation games were tough. Old school tough is a term for a reason. I am so horrifically bad at Zelda NES's combat that it's not even funny. I do okay against the basic enemies, but as soon as you throw a Dark Nut at me, it's game over. Sometimes, quite literally. I can't count the amount of times that I've died or lost most of my hearts in a dungeon thanks to a Dark Nut room. I know that I've got to hit them from the sides or behind, but they just don't stop moving. Link's range is very short, so I was always finding myself relying on his sword's projectile beam, which of course is only available if you've taken no damage, which was a state of health that I was rarely in. This problem was fixed in the not too distant future, as A Link to the Past replaces Link's default attack with a sword swing. God is Zelda NES's sword poke. Bring forth the swinging future. It's realistically a very small change, but it makes a world of difference. My lack of combat mastery doesn't necessarily make the game bad, but the punishment for a lack of expertise extends well beyond having to see the game over screen countless times. A big roadblock that I ran into on my first playthrough was the economy. At the time, I didn't realize that there were gambling caves, so I spent an inordinate amount of time running around Hyrule, ridding it of all its Octoroks, Moblins, and Levers, in an attempt to get those sweet 68 rupees to buy another potion from Grandma after I game overed. This process was repeated ad nauseum for the final couple dungeons. I won't forget the time when a like ate my shield in the middle of Ganon's dungeon. I was used to Ocarina, where a like eating your equipment meant that you just simply needed to kill it to get all your gear back. Chat let me down gently. Suffice it to say, I was utterly devastated. I did have the option to rewind thanks to my playing it on the NSO version, but I opted to suffer through the sadness and set out again to kill every moblin. I never really mastered the combat. In the footage playthrough that you're seeing now, I wasn't getting hit as much, so I ended up being a bit less reliant on potions, which was nice. I was still getting hit a lot, but a little less of a lot. As the playtime racked up, I could see and feel myself improving, but it only dropped my game overs from 12 in the streamed run to 9 for the run you're seeing now. A small comfort, really. I can see the appeal of mastering the combat, as it makes every subsequent playthrough feel tighter and faster, but I just can't see myself investing the time to master it right now. I feel like I've been a bit harsh on Zelda NES up to this point, so I'm going to take a step back and take a different approach for this next section. Most Zelda fans have heard the interviews with Miyamoto about how the map for Zelda NES was inspired by his adventures in the woods behind his childhood home. To me, this game exists to fulfill that sense of adventure that every kid has at one point, exploring the great unknown, walking around an unfamiliar world. Looking at the game through that lens, I can fully understand how Zelda NES's Hyrule was so engrossing, even if it wasn't my own experience. The lack of tutorials or explicit guidance built into the game only fueled that sense of adventure. I'm sure that kids growing up playing Zelda NES would have crafted their own stories, their own epic adventures set within this world. This version of Hyrule was engaging and engrossing for them, as Ocarina of Time's Hyrule was for me. It stands as its own type of game within the franchise that it birthed. Zelda 2 took the ideas and took them in a more RPG-like direction. Then, A Link to the Past redefined what Zelda is. Because of that, we've not really had another entry in the franchise quite like Zelda NES. You can trace Breath of the Wild's roots and general ethos back to it, but it's not exactly the same. While not the first adventure game, Zelda NES helped define what an adventure game could be. You can still see elements of its ideas in modern releases, some 35 years later. I wouldn't have had the memories and attachment I have to games like Ocarina if it weren't for Zelda NES laying down the groundwork. While it may feel rudimentary for me to play now, I have nothing but respect for what it set out to do, and how its design principles and ideas laid down the foundation for one of gaming's most recognized franchises. A large part of the experience with titles from this era of video games, as far as I can tell, was that sense of collective knowledge. Strategy guides and magazines were by and large the only ways to get 100% accurate information beyond flicking through the manual and just figuring it out by yourself. So people would seek an alternative, free solution, talking to their friends about it. In essence, your playthrough wasn't just you playing through it, it was you playing through it with the experiences of everyone else that had been playing it around you. Playground rumors were an integral part of games of that era, whether they were intentionally designed that way or not. Lunchtime would have been rife with kids excitedly telling their friends about the secret cave they found near the graveyard, or the area with really tough enemies. I largely grew up in an age where the internet was widely accessible. The only playground rumors I strongly remember were Mewtwo in Super Smash Bros. Brawl. I couldn't tell you what the alleged requirement was though. And various little secrets in Pokemon Diamond and Pearl. These rumors would have come from internet forums somewhere down the line, but as far as the young Chandy knew, they were just playground rumors from his mates. As I was nearing high school, YouTube was well and truly established, so if I needed to find something out, I'd just search there. There's a larger discussion to be had here about viewing older titles through the lens of a modern gaming experience. It's completely unfair to hold Zelda NES up against a contemporary adventure game like, say, Tunic, and go, the newer game has a bigger map, better graphics, better combat, and so on, because older titles simply cannot compete with technical aspects. Conversely, though these newer titles that share genre are technically superior, they're so indebted to Zelda NES for everything that it helped to create and define. Its DNA is ingrained in so many games across history. So that begs the question, if you're not someone from the era that the game you're looking at released in, what point of comparison can you make? I can't compare Zelda NES to similar titles of that era like Willow or Star Tropics because, well, I've not played them. My only frame of reference for older titles are those more recent releases that have iterated on and built upon these prolific pioneers of genre. I want to make it abundantly clear that I think Zelda NES is still a very good game. It's just not a game for me. Do I think that my experience with it was lessened because I didn't play it the way it was potentially designed around? Quite possibly. Do I think that it's a failure in game design for titles such as Zelda NES to be so obscenely obtuse in their sense of progression? Well, no. Do I regret using walkthroughs and guides to get through Zelda NES? Not entirely. Admittedly, a small part of me does wish that I got to experience the game in the same way that some of those creators that I grew up watching got to experience it. Some of the magic is definitely lost when I'm looking at what step comes next, but that's okay. Resources for beating video games have always existed in some form, and will continue to exist. I've always been a strong advocate for seeking guidance if you need it. I don't care if you didn't really beat it by looking up a walkthrough. I'd rather get past the part that's got me stuck so I can see the full game, than sit there frustrated with it and have one small part sour my experience as a whole. I know for a fact that my patience with the game would have grown thin if I kept banging my head against the hidden bombable wall in the hopes that I'd eventually break through. So after all this, where do I stand with Zelda's first adventure? Well, I like the game, but I also don't. I understand what it set out to do, and I have immense respect for what was made, especially since there's just not much quite like it nowadays. But it's not a game I can necessarily recommend to everyone. If you're a big Zelda fan, absolutely give it a try. Try beat the whole thing if you can. It'll only take a few hours if you're playing with a guide nearby. so it's a comfortable evening of play. If you're someone who's looking for an entry point into the franchise, especially for the 2D games, I'd say there are stronger titles that clean up and iterate upon what Zelda NES set out to do. Is it a game that I'll look back on fondly and replay endlessly? As it stands right now, I can very confidently say no. I may dabble with it on the odd occasion, but I have no burning desire to replay it at a moment's notice. I replayed it to get the footage you've seen throughout, and my opinion hasn't really changed. I just can't see myself wanting to go back over and over again. Its relatively short runtime is enticing if you can master the combat. It only took me about 3 hours with a guide up for the run you're seeing now. Maybe on playthrough number 7, when I know the map like the back of my hand, I'll get a fantastic couple hours out of it. But until that day comes, I look forward to seeing what the rest of the series holds for me. While I have endless respect for the founding entry in the series, its leap onto the next generation of hardware at the time is where I can see the franchise truly began.